Steve, I'd like to know a little bit more about your own background, because I understand that you're a scientist as well. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, from my earliest days, and I had a similar experience. I went to visit, as a young child, went to visit my grandmother in northern Missouri where there were no streetlights. And with friends, we'd go camp out in the pastures at night, and the Milky Way was just stunning. We borrowed some binoculars from a person in the neighborhood, and you know, I was just astounded at what was out there, and became very interested in science and in physics. I went to a liberal arts college as an undergraduate, but basically spent all my free time studying physics. Went to Caltech then to get my master's degree in physics, and that's where I first encountered sort of the atheistic mindset and the leading luminaries, if you will. So I was able to take a course in quantum electrodynamics from Feynman, and I had a course in nuclear synthesis from a guy named William Fowler, who later got his Nobel Prize in physics. He was a colleague of Fred Hoyle. Fred did most of the theoretical work, and I worked in the lab of Fowler that did a lot of the experimental work that led to confirming the carbon resonance. But then I decided I didn't really want to continue in physics. Physics, there was a worldview clash that I was seeing already. There was a hostility towards Christian worldview. And so I went off into the intelligence community and later into business. So I never was an academic physicist, but I know very well, how they think. I've lived in that world for a while. And when I was young, I was pretty smart and able to compute a lot of these things and do a lot of these things. So I then, worked in software, developed software for image processing. That's really what my company did. And that's why after that, when I returned and started talking to some of my former friends from graduate school, who were often tenured professors, they confirmed that a lot of the big problems had never really been solved, and that in the meantime there was this sort of rising tide against Christians. I mean, professors, friends of mine who are not Christians, nonetheless tend to just keep their heads down to even express, philosophical support for the idea of a Christian worldview, because the hostility in the academy now is extreme. And unfortunately, I don't think that bodes well for the future. I would encourage young people that have an interest in science, by all means, to go into it, to try to be a leavening effect, have a leavening effect on the academy, but also realize it will not be easy. It's likely to be very difficult. But there are those who went before you, like the Newtons of the world. You certainly have nothing to apologize for. Maxwell came up with Maxwell's equations, was Faraday. All very sincere Christians that basically invented most of what we call modern science and modern physics. And certainly nobody has any reason to fear science. It's just, I think we do need to re-engage it. If we let it go on this way, I'm afraid another generation or two, it will just be common knowledge throughout society that somehow science has eliminated the need for God, and in fact, in most people's minds, has disproven God, has established God, Christian God, the biblical God, as an ancient superstition that's been somehow superseded by modern science.
Let's just talk about John Lennox as a person, why he was such a great candidate to make a film about.
Sure. Well, I wanted to make a film that would have credibility to what I call the lazy atheists of today, somebody that's never really thought these things through, that will instinctively reject a theologian talking to them. Now, John has credibility with these people because he is a mathematician, so he sort of understands the rules of the game. He understands what science is all about. Now, in one sense, that's unfair. They should be willing to listen to a theologian or a philosopher or just anybody with elementary logic. But there's this visceral reaction not to want to listen to somebody that's not sort of one of the club. John is one of the club. He is a mathematician, not just a mathematician, but he's a professor of mathematics at one of the world's leading universities, if not the leading university. So John has an amazing amount of what we call street credibility with people. He can engage these people, and they can't just say, "Oh, well, you don't understand. You don't understand because you're not one of us." And so I also, when I started to look around at people who could address this, that had the sort of the academic credentials, realized that not many of them have the same kind of communication skills and the same kind of willingness to engage that John has. John is very much an evangelist. He's not just a mathematician that decided to take a look at this in an idle sense. He's thought about these things through his whole life, very, very deeply, and it's an integral part of what he is. Now, I think I know the kind of arguments that the materialist physicists use because I, associated with them for a long time, and I knew the kind of counter arguments that were effective, and John was making those kind of counter arguments in his books. He addressed the real issues in those books. Many times Christians would attempt to engage the Dawkins or Stephen Hawkings of the world, and they'd miss on something and kind of lose their credibility. John sort of got it. He was very good. He understood them. He understood how to counter them. He'd written several books, and it was obvious that he really knew how to engage us at an intellectual level. So we invited him as a speaker to our conferences, and there's kind of an interesting story about how I got to know John to start with, but I'll defer that to later. But John, we had him as a speaker, and what wasn't so obvious from his writings and his intellectual pedigree was that he's a great communicator. He's a very charming guy. He's engaging. He likes people. He puts them at ease, and he has an ability to talk and communicate at any appropriate level, whether it's with Dawkins or whether it's with the plumber. And I think he really is God ordained for this task. Some people have called him sort of the C.S. Lewis of our time because of the kind of the commonalities with C.S. Lewis. He's always kind of embarrassed by that, but I don't think that's far off the mark. What we need to do is to make John more famous like C.S. Lewis, if you will. We need to make him more known to the public because he is a wonderful resource with all these abilities and credibilities.
So, Steve, let's talk a little bit about the rise of scientific atheism. What is that exactly?
Well, today there's the view that science and Christianity are in conflict. They can't both be true, and that's sort of commonly taught in the culture. And that is based on the idea that science explains everything. And so the philosophical community calls that scientism. That's not a term that maybe the public would recognize, but that's what it means, is that science is all there is, and that all truth is science, and that science encompasses all truth. Now that leaves out almost everything that the ordinary person thinks is important. Things like, love, beauty, all those kinds of things are left out. They're considered by science not to be true. Now, if you go back to the beginnings of what we would call modern science, those people who were truly geniuses did not have that point of view. They realized the limits of science. In fact, in the early days, early scientists were referred to as natural philosophers. So if you go back to the time of Newton, the idea was that they were really philosophers who were looking at the natural world. And so I would argue that if you look historically, the early scientists, largely people responsible really for modern science, were for the most part Christians. Probably the greatest scientist that ever lived was Isaac Newton. And it's a little bit hard to sort of connote to the public just what a genius that guy was. But so before Newton, there were basic ideas of kind of proportionality and that, things moved in orbits that were somewhat predictable. But Newton came up with the laws of motion, the laws of gravitation. Basically we had a system of the world after Newton. And then he invented all the mathematics to be able to do that, because you couldn't do it with mathematics that existed when Newton was born. So he invented calculus, for instance.
He invented calculus.
He invented calculus because in order to solve the problems, the physics problems that he was investigating, they were insoluble with existing mathematics. And he was a bit of more than a bit, he was quite an oddball. So there were many things that he discovered he didn't even publish. And it wasn't until years later that they found out some of the things that he'd actually developed. So he was, what most people don't realize, and I certainly didn't realize until well after I was out of school, said he actually spent more time on religion and theology than he did on physics. And he taught himself ancient languages. He spent a lot of time studying the Bible. He was very, very serious about it. He was not just casual about it. He believed that the universe was set as a puzzle that man could solve. And I think you can see sort of the beginnings of that. And if man is set here as a steward over the universe, you have to be able to understand it to some extent in order to be a steward. So Newton looked at the universe as being intelligible because God had instituted it for man to be able to study and learn about. Now, with that point of view was perfectly natural to him, and the fact that he was able to discover laws that governed ordinary behavior was not at all in conflict. And I think over time, then what happened is many Christians fell into this sort of what they call God of the gaps fallacy, where if there was something science couldn't explain, they would say, well, see, that's where God is. And they kind of fell in this trap of somehow there were both explanations for the same behavior, the same phenomena, and really they are not. The Christian worldview is that God created physics. He created all these rules. He created these laws. And that's why they exist. He created the universe. He created space, time, matter, and energy. In some way that we can't understand, he is outside of space and time. He's not bound by it. And what you find is that scientists today don't understand that very often, because we're in a post-Christian world. When you say God to them, they're thinking of like Zeus or Jupiter. They've never studied the Bible. They've never really been around Christians with a sort of an orthodox understanding of Christianity. And to them, it is somewhat bewildering that the Christian idea of God. We're not talking about the kind of God that the Romans had or the Greeks had. We're talking about the supernatural, by definition, supernatural creator of the universe. So over time, what has happened is that society has become less and less based in a Christian worldview. We don't teach Bible in schools anymore. We don't teach about Christianity. And the public has fallen into this trap of thinking that science and Christianity are really competing explanations for the existence of the universe, and they are not at all. So if you there was a professor that I had in school named Richard Feynman, who was not just a Nobel Prize winner, but he was also sort of the Nobel Prize winner. He's very, very highly regarded, probably one of the top physicists, second half of the 20th century. And he used to say physics was about discovering the rules of the game. Now, Feynman was an atheist. He spent all his time on physics and science, and I don't think he spent much time at all thinking seriously about religion. But he used to say, science is about discovering the rules of the game. So we observe the universe and we figure out the rules of the game. So if you ask a scientist, why does this happen? They will pull out the equations that describe it and say, see, it's following these equations. But that's a very different question from saying, why do those equations even exist? Why is the universe what we see? John talks some in the film about the fine-tuning of the universe. The universe is so incredibly fine-tuned that it is truly bewildering that it could be anything else. And so you have even very secular people with, Fred Hoyle, for instance. You may have heard of Fred Hoyle, famous Cambridge cosmologist that actually turned came up with the term Big Bang originally. He was an atheist, but he studied the nuclear reactions that build carbon inside of stars. And of course, carbon is important to life. Well, it turns out there's a very odd sort of resonance that allows carbon to be built in the right amounts. And he said, it looked like some kind of super intellect had monkeyed with the laws of physics in order to make the universe what it is to allow us to be here. I think maybe later in life, he may have actually come around to becoming a theist because he realized how incredibly fine-tuned this world is.
For just a layperson, what does the word science mean?
Science is one of those things that has a very slippery definition. So science can be anything from just an organized body of knowledge, which is what a lot of biology started off as. You give names to different, and you classify things, and you organize knowledge, and you look at it. So you might talk about, science in that way. It's just a collection of knowledge that's put in some organized form. But I think what's given science its intellectual prestige, if you will, its credibility with the public at large, is the mathematical sciences, the things that allow you to build rockets that will go to the moon, to build nuclear weapons, those kinds of things. So I think with sort of World War II and the advent of sort of big physics, you had sort of the solitary geniuses like Einstein began to recede, and you started to have more of a professional science class of experts that receive a lot of tax money. So you have to be very careful if somebody says science believes this. Yes, there is a part of science that is basically physics and chemistry and engineering that is very precise and is unforgiving if you violate it. It's very testable. But then there's a lot of science like evolution, for instance, that is not really that testable. It's not that predictable. There's a story, there's a meta-narrative of how we got here that sounds plausible, but it's far different from the kind of definitive science that you have. Gravitation, for instance, you can drop a rock on your toe. Anybody can test that. It's very difficult to test the concepts behind evolution, much less a lot of these sociological ideas that have come along that are basically really just conventions and are not truly science in what I would call the original intent of the term. But because of that, people will use science as a blanket to try to lend prestige to whatever cultural ideas are in vogue at the time.
Right, and we're seeing a lot of that. I think that what John was saying is you can be a Christian and be a very good scientist, and you can be an atheist and be a very good scientist, in the sense that if it's the true hard sciences. But what we're seeing here, and I never thought about this until we started talking about it, is that there are things that are called science that are really more science philosophy or science theory that aren't hard.
No, that's right. So much is based on your presuppositions when you enter the argument. Mm-hmm. So if you start with the point of view that God is an ancient primitive superstition, and we need to get rid of it, then you look around and you look at the fact that we exist and that we're pretty complicated creatures, and you say, well, evolution must be true. We know it's true. So if you look in the fossil record and you find similar species, you'll say, see, they must be transitional. If you look at the Cambrian explosion and there's no good explanation for how that got there, you just say, well, gee, they must not have been preserved in the fossil record. It's not like something that you can go out and test. Much is based on your presuppositions, the idea of what you want to be true. And the same thing occurs maybe a little more subtly in physics and cosmology. If you're an atheist like Fred Hoyle was, you don't want there to have been a creation event because the Bible said God created at a point in time. Prior to Fred Hoyle's era, cosmologists normally thought the universe was eternal. So when they began to discover evidence of the Big Bang, Fred Hoyle coined that as a term of derision, the Big Bang. It sounds terrible. The Big Bang, he didn't like it. He fought against it for a long time. And why? Not because of the science, because of his presuppositions, that he didn't want the biblical view to be correct. science itself is really a miraculous thing if you think about it. I mean, the fact that these mathematical laws that we're able to understand allow us to predict to a large extent what happens in the universe, both at very far distances and down at the microscopic level, allows us quantum mechanics to design cell phones and computers. Einstein used to say the most miraculous thing about the universe, I'm paraphrasing, maybe getting a little bit wrong, but the most miraculous thing is that it's understandable. Another physicist, Wigner, said there's this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics to describe the universe. Why is that? Why is the universe constructed as a mathematical model, as an algorithm, as a set of laws that are fine-tuned to allow our existence? That's hard to explain if you don't have a theistic worldview. And so that leads them to say, well, there must be many universes, must be an infinite number of universes. Otherwise, the chances of having one like ours are essentially zero. Well, that's not science. That's philosophy masquerading as science. We have no evidence of other universes. We have no way to see other universes, to test them. But those are the kind of things that you're led to if you ignore the obvious evidence of your eyes. Just any child looking around realizes the enormous beauty and organized complexity of this universe. It's staggering, really, if you just step back and think about it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I think that while the scriptures say the heavens declare the glory of God, I believe, and I have some farm property, and this past year I went camping quite a bit. I camped with my grandkids and my children, and we camped for 9 weeks straight. And we're up on the side of a hill, and we can see the Milky Way. And a lot of city people today never see the stars because there's too much light. They can't ever get a chance to see what a magnificent view the Milky Way is, and it just fills you with awe. I've seen it when I've been in the desert, when I was in the deserts of the Negev and in Egypt and in Jordan, the night sky, and it's just amazing. And I'm sure that many of the ancients would look up to the sky, and there's a sense of, why am I here? And I think one of the things that I'm seeing here with your film Against the Tide is that John is basically saying that our biblical understanding of creation is not in conflict at all with science. The hard sciences are supportive of a biblical worldview. What's at opposition is there's a philosophy of science, right? There's a tone within it which basically doesn't want to have a God hypothesis in it, because there's other reasons there's other cultural and social reasons to eliminate God from the picture.
Yes, and those forces have unfortunately become very dominant over the past few decades. So when I was in school, most of the leading professors were probably atheists. Feynman was what I call kind of a lazy atheist. He didn't really want to engage in these discussions too much. He sort of took the attitude that, I'm a physicist. I spent all my time doing physics. Why would you ask me about these things? I really don't know anything about them, was sort of what I would say is the takeaway from me. Whereas today, you'll find leading physicists more than willing to say that because they have this great understanding of science, somehow they should be able to opine on these wider philosophical issues. And most of these people have little to no knowledge or education in those areas at all. In fact, there's a kind of a cute story about Feynman again, who he went to MIT as an undergraduate, and he had to take one humanities course. Didn't hear this from him, I read it in the bio later, but he had to take one humanities course at MIT in order to graduate with his degree in physics. And so what did he take? He took descriptive astronomy because there were no equations in it. So now, you roll forward and it's sort of disciples of Feynman now that are writing books about how God is no longer necessary. It's really ludicrous. They've never really thought these things through. They have no real expertise in the areas. And if they're honest, they would admit that. But what's different today is that you have people like, like Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking saying that because they are expert scientists and are well known by the public, they should be able to opine on these other issues with great authority. And it's just simply not true. And I think we need to say that. We need to sort of stand up and push back. And, sometimes the emperor has no clothes, and this is one of those times.
Yes, in the movie Against the Tide, John Lennox talks about Stephen Hawking saying that that the universe would have created itself. All it needed was the law of gravity?
Yes. Well, that's what you find often in their arguments is that there's this equivocation. That is, they'll use a word in a technical sense that the public uses in a different sense. And so, Lawrence Krauss or Hawking will say that the universe created itself from nothing. And what they mean by that is a quantum vacuum and all the laws of physics and quantum mechanics operating. And so, because there are all these potentials and there's this law of gravity that the universe would create itself, but it's not nothing. They're just rolling the laws of physics backwards and saying, look, this is where you are. And there doesn't necessarily have to be matter then. You have these particles popping in and out of existence in a quantum vacuum. But that is not nothing in the sense that the public thinks of it. Far from it. That's assuming all these laws of physics are operational. So really what they're saying is that they think they're able to roll laws of physics back to sort of the early nanoseconds of creation and to sort of compute a little bit about what God's thoughts were in those early instances of time. But it is by no means nothing.
Are there claims that are just way beyond reality? They're not really true. They're more or less philosophical.
The very existence of science that gives rise to an ordered universe that we can understand is a miracle. Why is that? Even if you grant that somehow life got started randomly on its own and that somehow evolution led to us as a species, and I don't personally grant that, but suppose you did. The whole miracle of consciousness is largely ignored. I can readily imagine, say you design some robots and you design them intelligently so that they would adapt over time and become better in their environment. So that's really what evolution says about us as an organic species. So these robots, over time, they evolve and they get better at getting their energy and so on. Well, what makes them become conscious? I mean, that's the whole business of consciousness is a huge mystery, and there's no natural explanation for it. You can imagine computers becoming more and more complex and reacting to their environment, like self-driving cars. Self-driving cars react to their environment. They avoid accidents. They propagate their life, if you will, by avoiding crashes, but they are not conscious. Now, when I was young, when I was in college, there was this movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, a story by Arthur Clarke. And you've probably seen that film. Most people have at some time. Now, when I saw that film, it was, I think, around 1970 or so. And at that time, the prediction was by 2000, computers would be sentient. They would be conscious, as it was portrayed in the film. Well, I saw a lecture by Arthur Clarke, the author, and somebody asked him, do you really think by the year 2000 computers will be sentient? And his answer was, oh, yes, my good friend, Professor so-and-so at the MIT Artificial Lab, and my good friend so-and-so, the professor at Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, they all assure me that the projector we're on, we're making great strides, and there's no doubt that by the year 2000, computers will be conscious and sentient. Well, computer hardware has advanced at staggering pace, far more than we anticipated in 1970. And yet here we are, 2021, and computers are nowhere near being sentient. They can do things very fast. They can do a lot of things they couldn't do before because they are, billions, sometimes trillions of times more capable. But they still are nowhere near conscious beings or sentient beings. So why is that? It's not just, it turns out it can't be just an emergent phenomena, the number of gates moving at a certain speed, because you look at the internet, you have all these connected computers, massive numbers of gates that outnumber the neural capability of a single brain, but the internet is not conscious. It's interesting if you go back and look at science fiction stories from the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was commonly assumed that if you made a computer big enough and fast enough, that consciousness would emerge, and that has not happened. So there's something ineffable and very special about consciousness. Now, we don't address this in great depth in the film, because there isn't time, but we do raise the issue, and I think that's another one of these things that science really does not address in any serious way, and has no credible tools to address it. Science can only address things that you can measure. If you can't measure it, if you can't quantify it, then it's not really science. It may be opinion, it may be a lot of other things, it may be a discipline of knowledge, but it's not science in the true definition. And there's no such thing as a consciousness meter. I can't take you and put you into a chamber and say you have 74.3 units of consciousness today. And, we really have no explanation for why there's this ghost in the machine, if you will. Why we have these discussions about morality and truth and beauty, why we even care about them. Why are our minds wired to appreciate and understand things like music and art, much less mathematics? What survival benefit does mathematics have to get us to this evolutionary point? The ability to throw a rock and hit another animal, that's useful. But the ability to solve the differential equations and send something to Jupiter, that's kind of a stretch as to why so much brain power would be allocated to something that had no apparent use throughout our evolutionary history. So that's just an example, but there are a host of these kind of problems and issues that are really outside the proper domain of science.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about this question of consciousness, I actually, about 3 years ago, filmed a scene. And as I thought about it, when was the first time I ever realized that I existed? And I was a child. I was waking up one morning, and I looked down, and I saw a foot in the bed. And I thought, whose foot is that? And then I looked at it, I saw my toes wiggle. I go, that's my foot. And then I looked out the window, and I said, well, where did I come from? It was just unusual to have this sense.
I think we would all benefit from that sort of self-reflection that seems to be missing from today's society.
Yeah.
The sort of assumption that all these problems have been solved by science, and that Christianity, all smart people are atheists, and Christianity is just a superstition. And it's just not true. But unfortunately, from a very young age today, we've conditioned people to think that those problems have been, those things have been answered by science. And so, as you referred to earlier, very few people today have the experience of going out and witnessing the nighttime sky, to have that sort of wonder as a small child of the universe, and our small place in it. Who are we and why are we here? Unfortunately, I think our modern society insulates people from a lot of those kinds of questions, and also from a lot of the unpleasant aspects of life in the past. We tend to insulate people from death and dying. It used to be, unfortunately, that many people would have children die, and that forces you, I think, necessarily to think about things beyond yourself and things beyond this life. Today, unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often. But even the normal progression of death in older people, we tend to isolate it now, and have a nice funeral with makeup and so on, and separate people from thinking about sort of death and ultimate reality. But I've had scientists say to me, "This God you talk about, what difference does it make? I mean, you can't see him, you can't measure him. He's nowhere around. So, there's no experiment that I can do to see if he really exists." But actually, there is an experiment, and it's an experiment we will all go through, and it's called death. At some point, we will all experience death, and we will all conduct this experiment, whether we like it or not. And then we will know. I think all the evidence supports the biblical worldview. There are certainly great mysteries, and I expect there will always be great mysteries. We are not God. We're not going to understand everything. But I think all the evidence, the preponderance of the evidence, if you're fair about it, if you just step back and look at the big picture, leads you to the God of the Bible. It explains so much about, and realize this was written a long time ago. This isn't something that somebody wrote last week after knowing that there was a Big Bang, knowing how fine-tuned the laws are. Heavens Declare the Glory of God was written well before Einstein and Fred Hoyle. And the kinds of considerations about evil in the world and those kinds of things are totally beyond the scope of science. And science has nothing to say about evil because science doesn't recognize evil as even existing. Although scientists will then complain that religion is evil. So, try to figure that one out.
Right. What we end up seeing is that if you basically live in a materialistic world, then there's really no right or wrong, right? It's just material.
There's no right or wrong. There's no reason not to just pursue whatever ethic you want to pursue. There can be no true standards.
Right.
Now they will try to argue that there are standards that they can derive from science, but it seems like very thin gruel to me. I don't see any rationale for it. And more importantly, I think if you look through history, if you look at atheistic societies, the society doesn't see any reason for an ethic beyond themselves. The state, whoever's in power, that becomes the ultimate authority, and there's absolutely no way to counter that.
And that's just not what the evidence is showing from what I'm hearing from people like Dr. John Lennox and Stephen Meyer and others.
That's not what the evidence shows. And I think privately, most of these physicists, most of the ones I know that even are atheists, would admit that. They don't want to admit to the biblical worldview, but they will privately admit that this universe is spookily constructed for our benefit.
Right. And that's the challenge. I have to tell you something. I have done, almost 20 years of interviews, and I've had some scholars who I'll go in and I'll talk with them, and on camera they'll be completely negative about evidence that points to the Bible. Turn the camera off, and they're like, "Can you tell me what you found?" They're really interested in everything. He said, and I have it on camera where people would say, "Oh, we talk about the Bible all the time. We see evidence for different parts of the Bible, but they say, well, we can't say anything about that because if we do, we'll be in trouble." And I've met some courageous archaeologists who said, "You know what? I'm tired. I'm not going to get fired from my job. I'm going to tell you what I see." But there has to be a dissonance in people's lives. Wouldn't you think that some scientists have a tremendous dissonance, knowing that these different, as they're exploring the laws of the universe, and it's resonating, if I were to say, towards a creator, there's got to be tremendous dissonance in their own life, but just to save their own tail, as it were, to keep their job. But honestly, I don't know. I'm just not that kind of person, and it frustrates me when I see that it's not quite honest to what the reality is pointing to.
Well, unfortunately, science and education in general has become big business. So, the public thinks about the solitary genius, wandering around trying to develop something in their laboratory. That just isn't the case anymore. High energy physics is done by massive teams. If you look at the papers that are published, there'll be 20, 30 names on it. The experiments, the large accelerators cost hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. Space telescopes that cost massive amounts of money. So you need to think of science more as a government-dominated business. And the way you succeed is by not offending people that rate papers and give out grants, that sort of thing. So unfortunately, it's very difficult today to be a rebel in science or even in education. If you think back, Newton, for instance, Newton was the son of a relatively poor, gentleman farmer. Went off to Cambridge, had to empty chamber pots. Went home, but he's brilliant. Somehow he's a genius, right? I mean, he read Euclid for the math professor there and called it a trifling book. Went home during the plague years and invented calculus and solved the problem of planetary motion. How is that? How does that happen? It doesn't happen today. Somehow, everybody is educated in such a way that we don't seem to have those geniuses anymore. Einstein did his special relativity and basically was a founder of quantum mechanics as a patent clerk. And he couldn't get a job as a professor, right? So he was a patent clerk when he did all this stuff. There's something wrong either with the way we're educating people today, or the problems are just so difficult that human intellect can't really address them anymore. So you can kind of take your pick. But I think it certainly is true that everybody now is educated and socialized in a very narrow way compared to the old days, where essentially everybody was self-educated, homeschooled and self-educated, and therefore eccentric geniuses were allowed to flourish more than today. Today we look for the smartest people, not necessarily the genius. There's great difference between intelligence and wisdom. And I think there's also a great difference between just raw intelligence, being able to solve a mathematical problem very rapidly, and having tremendous insight into what it means. And that's what people like Einstein had. It's what people like Newton had. It's a mystery to me, and a topic I always like to discuss with my science friends, as to why today, if you look at the educated population today, it's vastly larger than it was in the 17th and 18th, 19th centuries. Why were there all those geniuses back then and there are none of them today? We throw around the term genius all over the place today. Everybody's a genius. Hawking's a genius. Everybody's a genius. None of them could hold a candle to Maxwell, or Einstein or Newton. What are we doing wrong today that we're spending all this money, 1,000 times more money, probably 10,000 times more PhDs than ever before, and yet all we get are large collections of papers that are narrowly written that essentially nobody reads and have very little fundamental import. Perhaps a little bit off topic, but.
Well, maybe it is because the foundational premises, and I'm just reacting here, is that what made a number of other people see something that others couldn't see is that they had a different point of view that allowed them to see. And as I've been working in the work that I've worked in with patterns, is I've seen patterns that other people haven't seen with the types of films that we're doing, because I'm an outsider. And in some ways, the question then is that there's a paradigm, right? There's a paradigm that might be over the top of people that is limiting them from the genius that could possibly be found. And Newton and these others had a different paradigm. They had a paradigm that they were discovering the universe that God had created.
Yeah, I think they had an entirely different motivation, and their brains didn't work the way normal people's brains work. And so, they were allowed to flourish independently. Newton really was a singular genius, and when you talk to physicists that really understand sort of the overall structure, how we got to where we are, Newton was just an amazing person. What he did in his lifetime was just incredible. But Newton would not survive in a modern school system. Newton was an oddball, and Einstein was an oddball. And I don't think you could put them in a modern school system. They would be, taught very different ways. They would be socialized to be different kinds of people. They'd probably be giving, drugs to attention deficit controlling drugs or something to keep them from being so weird. And then society would pronounce that they'd done something great, but we wouldn't have those geniuses. Tesla was similarly a very eccentric genius, very strange, very oddball kind of guy. But sometimes it's those very strange, oddball kind of guys that are able to think in different ways and pursue it. Now, obviously, there's a fine line. You have to be careful that you don't just open the door to every crackpot. But science is, at least in theory, somewhat self-correcting. So any new ideas or theories have to at least predict what the old ones did.
Science is not in conflict with a biblical worldview, and that's what John Lennox is trying to tell us. And what would your final words be to people? Why should they see this film and maybe share it with their own families and friends? Why is this film so important today?
Well, when I was young, I was very interested in science, and I was in a Christian home. I would ask questions that appeared to establish conflicts between science and Christianity. And mostly what I would get was, gee, don't ask those questions. Don't think about stuff like that. And I think that's the wrong answer. I think the right answer is to say that God is truth, and that properly understood, there will be no real conflict between science and Christianity. And I think the deeper you delve into this, the more you realize that there really is a harmony. Now, will everything always be perfectly explained to our satisfaction? Certainly not. Because, again, we are limited. We are finite creatures. We are not God. But God has told us in the Bible what we need to know, and there's no conflict between the Bible and science. In fact, it explains why science exists. It explains the fine-tuning of the universe. But it also explains why science is not everything. Science is the stage, is the universe on which this, as R.C. Sproul would say, this drama of redemption takes place. So what is fundamental and what is important is to put science in its place, give the glory to God that He established science. But don't fear God. Don't fear science. Don't be afraid of science. The beginning of wisdom is studying the Lord, fear the Lord. What is truly fundamental is what God is, creation of our souls for eternity, and how we view good and evil, and the fact that we are creatures created by God in His image. And if we don't recognize that, if we don't live our lives that way, then nothing else will make sense.
Well, thank you, Steve, for being on the Historical Faith Society, and we're really excited about Against the Tide. And thank you for really getting behind it and being the executive producer. We're looking forward to this great event. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's been a privilege. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.